Good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday, 24th of August. You're watching Resistance TV, and thank you for joining us this evening. So far in our Sex in the Summer season, we've mostly been focusing on the impacts of gender ideology on adult women. So we've looked at that in terms of free speech within the Labour Party particularly. We've looked at it in respect of women within prisons, and we've also looked at it in respect of policing and the strip searching policy. So this evening, our guest is a psychotherapist, a speaker, an author, and a podcaster called Stella O'Malley. Who has many years professional experience of working with parents and children, and more recently founded the organisation Genspect. And tonight, Stella's here to help us bring the focus into the direct impacts of gender ideology on the health and well-being of children and young people, as well as on their parents, as well as on the parental bonds between parents and children, and also the impacts on clinicians who work with children and families to help them through issues such as gender confusion or gender dysphoria. So just a quick welcome to those of you that are in the chat. Thank you for joining us this evening. And please, we'd like to encourage you to take part, bob in comments in the chat, but also questions as well. And we will come back to those in the last sort of 15 minutes of the session and pose some of your questions to Stella. So welcome, Stella. Thank you very much for coming along this evening.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. It's good to have you here. I know that you've spoken many times about this issue in depth through various formats, through your writing and through interviews and so on. But within the left, particularly, we've got a lot of suppression around this issue. So there'll be a lot of people listening who haven't really had an opportunity to look at this from a sort of healthcare and well-being perspective, or to hear a professional perspective and some professional insight on this as well. So that's what we're kind of trying to bring to people this evening, rather than just a politicized topic that's quite distant from people, to actually kind of bring a closer lens on it from your perspective. So my first question really, it's in relation to therapy, the kinds of therapy that psychotherapists offer, not necessarily in relation to gender dysphoria, but just in general. Like, how much does it vary between one psychotherapist and another? Like, is there obviously there'll be recognized good practice, but beyond that, how much variation is there in the approach that you tend to take?
It's a great question. I wish more people asked that question. There's huge differences in the therapy that you get. So people think, oh, I need to go to therapy. And they ring up, they look online, they get a recommendation and they go with that. And actually, who you get really matters. It's very like teaching. One person will say, that's a great teacher. They saved my life. They were brilliant. And another person will say, I had that teacher. She was awful. She was absolutely awful. It's kind of the same with therapy. And what the studies have shown, that it doesn't really matter about your technique as much as the relationship. And what they found in therapy, it's the therapeutic relationship, that your relationship, the therapist's relationship with the client is everything. And it makes a huge difference. But within that, there are kind of three main strands. Now, I'm being very basic here, but the kind of big strands would be psychoanalysis, which would be the old style Woody Allen, which would be I would argue you'd have to have an awful lot of time and probably an awful lot of money to be able to have psychoanalysis, because sometimes you're seeing the analyst maybe 3 times a week for many years, and serious commitment, and asks questions, I think, of therapy. Should we be seeing somebody for so long? But then there is the kind of the Carl Rogers humanist kind of person-centered, which I would have learned a lot about when I was studying, which is very much the client is the expert, let them lead the way. And some people have criticized that as kind of nodding dog therapy, because somebody can be there for a long time without any change. And so then in came up the kind of more active, directive kind of therapies, which is, let's say, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's very active, challenging, giving tasks. And one person could just say, I hate that. I don't want to be given a task. I want somebody to listen to me. So it depends on the person.
Okay. So with respect to gender confusion or gender dysphoria, I know that there hasn't been, I mean, the CAS report kind of pointed out to us that there hasn't really, it's not only not been agreement necessarily amongst clinicians as to how to approach that issue with young people and with their parents. But in many cases, they've been almost diametrically opposed approaches. And some therapists have felt sort of compelled to offer certain approaches of therapy, more affirmative models, when they felt ethically compromised in doing so. I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about Genspect, about why you set Genspect up, thoughtful therapists, and what some of the differences are with regards approaches psychotherapists might take with this issue?
Yeah, very much so. So until about 10 years ago, conventional therapy on every level explores the issue with the client. And that's what you do. So anybody who comes in, if you came into me and you said you wanted to leave your partner, we would explore it. And other things could emerge. And that would be conventional, traditional talk therapy. Then about 10 years ago, very only specifically for the world of gender, a concept called gender affirmative model of care came in. And the concept was that really the therapist wasn't a therapist. The therapist was more a facilitator. And the job of the therapist who gives gender affirmative care is to facilitate medical transition. And so it's very heavy kind of emphasis on the medical model. And if somebody came to me and I was to be a gender affirmative therapist, my job is not only to affirm, but to confirm all of their beliefs around their gender identity, and to facilitate so that they could get medical intervention as soon as they wish, at any age. And that goes as young as 2 or 1.5. So it's really like it's not even, you wouldn't even say child-centered, you'd say it's child-led. Now, that is a massive change. And there is no other condition in psychology that I know of where the child, for example, leads, and the child self-diagnoses, and the child suggests the treatment path. This is all very, very unusual, very, very unconventional, and very much based upon what I would argue is a presumption that being gay is the same as being trans.
Right.
And therefore, this has nothing to do with mental health. They might have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, but it's based upon a kind of a depth, a kind of a soul within you. And it's a gender soul. And this
is what your true self is.
Yeah, it's your true self, whatever that means. Very, very, to me, as an Irish Catholic, it reminds me of my mother talking about my Catholic soul. I don't think I have a Catholic soul. She says you do. I have no option. And it's unfalsifiable, if you follow me. And that's what the gender identity is within you. And so it's all based upon a theory about gender identity, that we have it within us. And it's very much conflated with what being gay is. Being gay is one, being trans is the other. It's like being gay is now, being trans is considered being gay in the 21st century or something. It's been a huge leap, and it was never considered that before. It's a new concept, and it has meant there's been a huge chilling effect on therapists, because therapists thought, oh, I don't know anything about this. I don't feel comfortable not exploring issues, because that's why I'm in therapy. That's why I am a therapist. And so I'm just going to refer on to gender affirmative clinics, because I don't know what to do. And that's why there's huge waiting lists for all these gender clinics, because therapists won't touch it. Therapists are afraid to touch it. They won't touch it.
They're not quite sure what to do with it.
No.
Well, so before this ideology arrived that says that being trans is the same thing as being gay, it's just something you're born with, it's your real true self. Before that happened, what sort of approach was taken to someone who was confused about their gender? Like, what sort of age would they normally be showing up with that complaint? What gender would they be?
Yeah.
And how did people respond? Yeah.
Right. Up until, again, about 10 years ago, everything changed about 10 years ago, and we're seeing the difference. And that's why we're talking about it, because up until 10 years ago, it was tiny numbers and was two very different cohorts. It was very small little boys, like we're talking 3, 4, 5-year-olds, who generally turned out to be gay. These are very effeminate little boys that we all spotted when we were kids. And secondly, middle-aged males.
Okay.
And they were the two groups. They were the people who wanted medical transition. And arguably, those middle-aged males who did end up transitioning have changed a lot of policies and changed a lot of our approaches to what is gender as such and what is medical transition. And out of nowhere, in the last 10 years, it came in like a rocket. There's been an extraordinary rise among teenagers. Teenagers never came in any sort of numbers looking for gender transition. And female teenagers were just absolutely never there. They were just
Mm,
when I say never, I mean incredibly seldom.
mm,
And so it's a whole new cohort that arrived with this,
mm.
which opens up more questions, I think, than any, because why? Why would suddenly 10 years ago loads of female adolescents seek medical transition and they never have before? And
Yeah.
why isn't the corresponding females like me, who's 47, why aren't we, now that it's more accepted, why
Yes.
aren't we in our droves beating the doors of the clinic down? Because
Yeah. Yeah.
that would explain more acceptance, but
Yeah.
we're not.
Yeah. So that this increase, if it was just a natural result of greater social acceptance of being trans, similar to what we had with people, being able to come out as gay and not get beaten up
Exactly.
or abused or whatever for that. If it was the same thing, you'd expect to see an equal-ish number of people, maybe male and
You'd
female, or
certainly, yeah.
yeah,
One, it would be an equal-ish number, like you say,
yeah,
of male, female, and you'd see corresponding in the other age groups. You wouldn't
yeah,
see this extraordinary rise in adolescent and
mm,
literally no rise in the 40 something, or when I say no
yes,
rise, very, very little. It
amongst women particularly,
Yeah,
yeah,
it doesn't make sense.
yeah,
Doesn't
no,
make
no,
sense. The numbers are so strangely unbalanced. All you can
mm.
do is say there must be more going on.
Yes, that we
This
don't really know what we're
Yeah,
dealing with or what we're
we
looking at.
don't.
Yeah.
I don't.
So, I mean, I don't know whether you've heard of Novara Media, but they're a left-wing sort of media outlet, and they recently put an article out called, what was it? How to Navigate Britain's Broken Trans Healthcare System. Um, and the quote was, "Keep it." They were kind of encouraging young trans people or young people who were gender questioning, to keep things simple when they see the gender clinic, when they get their referral and they get in front of a specialist, to not really talk about general sort of mental health concerns, but to keep it very focused on, I'm here because I'm trans and I'd like some HRT and I've got my papers, and to just keep it very narrowly focused on that. I'm not sure whether the purpose of it was so that they wouldn't be converted, this thing about conversion therapy, or whether they would get through the system a lot quicker because there's this huge wait. I'm not sure what the purpose of it was, but that came out. But there was another thing that they'd tweeted out or put out, which also said, J.K. Rowling is right. Autistic people are far more likely to be transgender. That doesn't make them any less deserving of gender affirming care. So there's a very sort of strong push, it seems, within the sort of more politicized, not from the clinician point of view necessarily, but from the politics side of things, to say that, yes, there are, the cast reviewers found that there's far more girls now in their teens than boys, and that's of concern, and we need to find out more about that. And we're seeing a much higher proportion of children who are looked after, they're in care, much higher proportion of children who have autism and other sort of neurodiverse conditions, and we need to find out more about that and be somewhat cautious about how we're approaching this. But people who are involved in the political side of it, who are saying, no, this is your gendered soul, you need to just be affirmed in it, are kind of saying, it doesn't matter that you're autistic, you still should be affirmed. There's
Mm.
nothing remarkable about that. I mean, have you got any
I have
particular
plenty.
thoughts on that? Go on.
Yeah, I have plenty to say.
Thought you might, yeah.
For starters, the keep it simple bit, uh, I am not I think we need to complexify the issue. I think this idea of keeping things simple, keep it simple and give me give me the hormones, keep it
Yes.
simple and give me the medical interventions. Sometimes this kind of this new generation, contemporary world that we live in, we're living in slogans, and
Hmm.
they can be very pat, and they don't give much room for complexity or nuance. And that's not me trying to sly in any concept. It's just me saying, honestly, we live in a very sophisticated, complex world. And to keep it simple is probably reducing the thoughts and probably not serving the issue well. I saw somebody said why people in care is a trauma. And I just want to talk a little bit about the cohort, because it's not simple. This is a dense subject that it took me years to start speaking about, because
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, there's so much to learn. If you think this is simple, you've missed it. You've missed
Hmm.
so many things if you think this is simple. But
Yeah.
one of the reasons I would argue that children in care is that maybe they're seeking their identity. Maybe they have an awful lot of people who are working with them who maybe perhaps might be part of the kind of the more a certain generation of workers who are very, very into gender identity, and as in they're in their 20s, and it's kind of it's a very hot topic, which leads into the issue that I think I most want to point out here, is that politics have got in the way of mental health here. And politics have got in a way that they really, it's so unfortunate when politics get into mental health or medical care. We saw it with abortion over in America. It's just so nasty. It's so awful. Politics, in a way, getting into medical care is really frightening when it happens, because everything gets, I do think the patient gets lost. The person who needs care, often a very vulnerable person, really really gets lost. What was the second point you said? One was about the simple, and the second...
They said, well, they said don't share that information with you, or something along the lines of, keep it simple. Just say you'd like the HRT. Say that you've got the necessary documents, and also that J.K. Rowling is right. Just because you have autism, so why shouldn't you be affirmed?
That's
anyway,
the point I wanted to continue with, the autism. The autistic point is really very interesting. There's a study, from a peer-reviewed study from the Tavistock, which has kind of received a very, very negative review in recent months from an independent reviewer, Dr. Hilary Cass. But that study showed 48% of the adolescents presenting were autistic. We're talking high numbers of autism in this cohort. And when you look at autism and when you study autism, you'll realize they are very often gender nonconforming. They're very often societally nonconforming. They don't follow silly rules, if you follow me. They don't follow rules that don't make sense to them. They want to wear the clothes they want to wear, and they don't really care whether it's a dress or shorts. It's what they want to wear, if you follow me. This is themselves. And wouldn't it be great if we lived in a society where that didn't lead to any medical interventions, that little boys could run around in a dress, or, that there's no kind of presumption. To call that trans, to me, is making a leap that I would be comfortable with. I think being gender non-conforming is something that society needs to kind of accept, that you can live, like, there's lots of ways to be a woman, there's lots of ways to be a man, and to kind of reduce it to kind of clothes or activities or games is very reductive and very, very constraining for lots of people. And people who are autistic particularly don't like silly, mindless rules around clothes or things. They just want, they want the red cup and the green jumper, and that's what they want. And there's a black and white thinking with the autistic mind that we need to be very gentle and caring about, because that, you could say, explains a lot around the pronouns and things like that. If an awful lot of them are autistic, and they are people who are seeking medical transition, they will think that if you say I'm female, then I am, because the words are enough, because there's a literal understanding. They don't understand things on a metaphorical level as much. They're more literal. And so I remember I knew a girl who was autistic, and her mother, and we were talking, and she was identifying as trans at the time. She isn't anymore. And I was talking to her about testosterone, and I was saying, if you put testosterone in a female body, you have huge impact. Like, it's very, very harsh on the body. And it can lead to a lot of kind of vaginal infections. It can lead to an awful lot of pain on intercourse. It can lead to all sorts of infertility. It's a huge event. And she was autistic, and she said, oh, no, but it wouldn't for me, because I'm male, because I go by he, him.
Yeah.
So there's an autistic person with a very literal understanding. If you call me he, him, you can give me testosterone and it won't impact my body. So it shows to me that how you really need to understand that changing a person's perception of who they are, we shouldn't do it lightly, especially if they're vulnerable.
And it's like you were saying, I mean, if we were a more accepting society, that there's such a thing as gender nonconformity, we're not all the same. We don't all express how we feel in the same way. We don't all like to dress in the same way, depending on whether we're male or female. And that's okay. If schools didn't have prescriptive expectations with regards to uniform and things like that, then would that save, in your view, a lot of children from undergoing what can be lifelong medicalization?
And a very heavy medical burden on the body. Even if you're the most pro-trans person in the world, it's very heavy. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
It's very difficult physically on the body, not alone all the surgeries. But yeah, and to go back to that piece that said, yeah, they're all, lots of autistic people are trans, and I would argue, no, lots of autistic people are gender non-conforming, and that's a different emphasis. That's a different kind of, it's the same thing, but looking at it in a different way. One person could say it's trans, and another person could say it's gender non-conformity. I would love that we could bring in a society where gender non-conformity didn't need to be boxed up, didn't need to be medicalized, didn't need to be labeled. And kids and adults could be gender non-conforming without any big medical treatment.
Big deal.
Yeah.
As like you say, sometimes when a child is gender non-conforming, that can be the first indication that they're actually going to grow up to be same-sex attracted, but that's not always the case. So far on the shows that we've done, I think the 3 women that I've interviewed have all said to me that they were that gender non-conforming girl when they were a kid. I mean, I wasn't. I was pretty much dolls and fairies and all that kind of thing. But I find it interesting because I've heard so many women who are sort of feminists who are involved, in left politics or whatever, about this issue have said, God, that was me. I was that kid. And I shudder to think of what I might have done to my body, thinking that I was doing the right thing. And also that a lot of children, when they're approaching puberty, it's not a comfortable time for a lot of children. And a lot of children really would like to bypass that process as well. So it's kind of, I don't know. I see this and I hear it from a lot of women and gay men I've heard as well saying that they were gender non-conforming as a child, grew up, went through puberty, and it turned out that they were gay. And they're so glad that they didn't do anything that would have harmed their fertility, their sexual function, caused them osteoporosis, or any of these things that we're hearing about happening to children's bodies and huge impacts.
Yeah, I was that myself. I was very gender non-conforming, and I wanted to be a boy for many years. And puberty was terrible for me because I didn't want to be a girl or a woman, and it was a really painful time. It was a horrible time. But puberty also was the time where, because I was allowed to have puberty, I started to fancy other people, and so the focus left me as such and went to other people. When you stop puberty, you're stopping a sexual awakening. And you're stopping sexual development. And we've never done that to humans ever before. And it's the most high-handed authoritarian thing I've ever seen, to stop a child's sexual development and sexual awakening. And between 10 and 20, the child goes from pre-sexual usually to sexual. And we've never stopped it before. And now we're stopping it. And it chills me, the impact that must have, because they remain childlike. So they kind of find sex, just like anybody under 10, a bit squeamish, a bit weird, but they're 16.
Yes.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's an extraordinary thing to do on a child.
So a puberty blocker, if we can just talk in a little bit more depth about that is something that would be taken before puberty, and it will block things like brain maturation, brain development through those teenage years, as well as suppress secondary sex characteristics. What do we know about what other effects that has on children?
Well, we don't know, because this is an ongoing experiment. It's a medical experiment on children that we don't know the results of. What we do know is, in around about 1980, they brought in a concept called puberty blockers, and it was a great idea. It was for children with precocious puberty, so a child who went into puberty at maybe 4, and they would block their puberty until they were ready to go into a proper puberty, let's say at about 10, which is the typical age. And that's why they were designed, and that's why they were created. And then in the kind of 90s stroke noughties, a clinic in Holland decided, in an extraordinarily ambitious and perhaps reckless piece of experimentation, decided to stop the puberty of children who might seek to medical transition in the future. And how they did this was they gave them this very stringent process, which I now I know children who've gone through that clinic, it's not so stringent, but they said it was very stringent. And they said that, as if they were some forms of gods, these clinicians in the Dutch clinic, they could see into the child's eyes and they could know which child was going to remain identifying as trans, and which child was going to grow out of it. They would know. So they would say, you can't go forward, but you can. You can't. Now, I remember when I was a kid, I would have convinced any adult. I know I would have. I had it for many, many years, these gender distress, and it didn't go away easily. And I was a very forceful personality. So I was like thinking, sure, that's to do with force of personality as opposed to deep distress. You know, some kids just go quiet and they wouldn't tell you. And another kid would be like banging the doors down, and I would have been banging the doors down. And so this clinic brought it in. They called it the Dutch protocol. In about 2008, 2009, all these American clinicians came over. They decided it was the gold standard of pediatric gender care, all new, all experimentation, brought it over to America. From then on, they changed the guidelines so that therapists like myself are just facilitators, and it has sprung out as a huge issue. Suddenly, a huge amount of adolescents are identifying as trans. They all want to get puberty blockers. By the way, you don't get it before puberty. You get it just when you start puberty. It's just the beginnings of it. And they have, on an extraordinarily reckless experiment on these children, they've stopped their sexual development. So if they were gay, they don't know, because their sexual development has been stopped. If you stop your sexual development, if you stop my sexual development, and I was 10, my vagina would stop growing. It would remain as a 10-year-old. It's the same for a little boy. And so you would grow up, you'd be 13, 14, 15, and it would remain the sexual characteristics of a 10-year-old, if you follow me, because you've blocked the growth. And I would argue that would create a very out of sync feeling with your body, because one part of your body isn't growing and everything else is, if you follow me.
Yeah.
And not only that, you've no sexual awakening. You saw that, maybe if any of you have watched Jazz Jennings, she's a kid who's a trans kid, the first trans kid really that anybody has documented. And she came out as a trans kid in about 2006, 2007. And they blocked her puberty. And when all the girls started fancying the boys, and the boys fancying the boys, and the girls fancying the girls, she had nothing to add to that conversation. And she ended up homeschooling. She was out of sync. Anyway, long story short, is we now have this situation where these kids who've been blocked sexually, and then they go through a chemical puberty when they're of age, maybe 17, 18. And so the chemical puberty is of the opposite sex. We've never done this before. It's a chemically induced puberty. We don't know what happens to your brain when you don't fancy people, when you don't have a sexual awakening at 12, 13, 14. We don't know, because we've no way of getting into the brain to figure it out. But we are noticing quite worrying results of this extraordinary experiment.
So it's not, because you hear about people who've detransitioned, and I know that there are a number of kids or families that are taking the Tavistock clinic to court on the basis that they feel that they haven't been adequately informed of what the potential outcomes might be, and that they haven't been given a realistic idea of whether they can actually change sex or what transition is going to look like. But it sounds like you're saying is that it's not even that they haven't been informed, that it's that the clinicians themselves can't say, because they don't know. It's a complete experiment. The ethics of it are mind blowing.
And it goes back to the child led. They say, oh, we just listen to the child. And I'm like, well, would you listen to the child over their diabetes care? Would you, like, really listen to the child? Because whatever happened to I studied it for 7 years, and then I was an intern, and then I became an expert from studying it. Whatever happened to that, for starters? But the second thing is, like, for example, Kira Bell would be a well-known case. I had a lovely chat with Kira today, and she's doing very well. But like, she was a very traumatized teenager, very like myself, but she lived 30 years later. And she ended up going to the Tavistock. They affirmed her, because she said she was a boy, and they listened to the kid, and they said, if she says she's a boy, she's a boy. If she says she wants puberty blockers, she gets puberty blockers. So they gave her puberty blockers. And then a little bit later, they gave her the cross-sex hormones, which is the kind of next step. Then they gave her the mastectomy, which is what she wanted. She was very traumatized. She'd had a very difficult childhood. And then a few years later, when she came into her early 20s, she kind of had a reckoning and realized, I was traumatized. What the hell were they doing? Why were they listening to me? I was all over the place. I was upset. And she realized that affirmative care might be kind in the moment, but was very cruel in the long term.
Yeah.
because it nodded along in her hour of need, didn't listen to any of her kind of effective, metaphorical, symbolic cries of help where she was like, I'm lost and I don't know who I am.
Mm.
That didn't get read. Instead, it was, I want puberty blockers, give them to me. And they gave it to her.
Mm.
And many detransitioners like Kira have now started speaking out. So you asked me about Genspect earlier. I founded Genspect about a year ago because I want to bring a rational voice to gender. I'm very aware that it's a toxic debate, and I'm trying to bring a voice of reasonability and rationality to it. And it was very much because so many parents had come to me with utter distress about how their children were being treated in this very, very kind of mindless manner, being led into medical interventions. And in Genspect, we have a program where we help detransitioners because we believe detransitioners have been very badly treated. And when I first started following, for example, DTrans Reddit, there was less than 1,000 members on this, and I urge anybody who's watching to go look up DTrans Reddit. You'll find it very easily. There was less than 1,000 members on it, and now there's over 37,000. And I started following it in about 2019. And what is it now, 2022, and there's over 37,000. That's not to say they're all detransitioners. They're not. I think the moderators say about a third of them are detransitioners, which still makes up thousands. But if you read the story, you'll see again and again and again, these were young kids who were very distressed, who were affirmed when they needed help and support and gentleness and compassion, and they didn't get it. And so in Genspec, we've started a kind of a program where we offer them, and we're helping to pay for their counselling and other things just to help them out, because we feel they're the minority within the minority. They've been silenced and treated incredibly badly by various different people. And I have to say, like you mentioned the left earlier, the left have been incredibly silencing in almost a Stalinist kind of way of silencing any kind of debate, silencing any kind of questions, any sort of negativity. It's been a shocking revelation to me to watch how authoritarian the left can be. I thought the left were the woolly-minded nice side.
So did I.
And what I've seen is the left can be a hard line. We don't care about the individual. For the good of it all, we will suppress the voice of detransitioners. We don't care that there's detransitioners there, because we need to promote. We've decided in a very kind of institutional level, we're promoting the voice of transitioners, so we cannot give any voice to detransitioners. It's actually, I've seen the kind of been to the belly of the beast, and it has been a horrible sight.
It's like you said before, isn't it? It's a very blanket application of a viewpoint which is very simplistic to an issue which is actually very complex, very nuanced, with a lot of very, very vulnerable young people involved in it. I mean, so in terms of, I want to ask you about parents, but before we come on to that, in your view, based on the parents and the children that you've seen, how much of this is about kind of gender stereotypes and confusion around that? How much of it is about gender nonconformity they're probably going to grow out of? How much of it is influenced by online agendas and trends and influences and things like that? What is this? Is gender dysphoria a genuine thing? If so, is that just for a small minority of people who show up saying that they're confused about their gender? And does the approach to genuine gender dysphoria, if that exists, does it need to be something more along the lines of body dysmorphia or something like that within anorexia? I mean, can you unpick some of that for us a little bit from your point of view?
Yeah, it's really hard to figure it out. I know a lot of people say gender dysphoria doesn't exist because gender is a social construct, and I don't really know what to say about that, because I had my own issues. Now, do you want to call it gender dysphoria? Do you want to call it sex dysphoria? It's like the conversations about bipolar. It's gone through loads of different names. Schizophrenia, it's gone through loads of different names. We kind of know what it is. Does it exist? Yes, it does. Do we argue about the name? ADHD is a terrible name for that condition. It's just a name. The point is the condition. And the condition is, or the feeling, or, the experience. And certainly when I wanted to be a boy, I really wanted to be a boy. That's what I wanted to be. Is that anything to do with social constructs, or was that because I wanted to be on the boys' team? On every level, I felt I'd be better as a boy. I still think I'd be better. I would have been better as a boy. But, I learned to live with my body, because coming of age means you have a reckoning with yourself, and you realize there's some things I have to just accept about my life. Would I change the circumstances of my birth? I probably would. Would I change my parents, my hometown? Yeah, change it all. But you can't. That's what life is kind of giving us. And so there is that. And a lot of the children who are like me, who want to be the opposite sex, generally, often, not always, grow up to be gay. I didn't grow up to be gay, but most of them do. Certainly the boys, very much so. And then there's a whole online phenomenon that seems to be a very different experience. And this is the teenagers. And this is specifically the teenage girls. And when you look at that, you think, this isn't an awful lot to do with I want to be a boy. It's almost metaphorically I want to be a boy. But and I know Sasha I do a podcast with Sasha Ayad called Gender a Wider Lens. I recommend it.
It's fantastic. It is. Me too. Yeah.
We love it. And I remember Sasha saying very often these teenage girls, it's not so much I want to be a boy, but I don't feel pretty enough to be a girl. I don't feel I'm a girl. I don't feel good enough to be a girl. And I found with the boys, I don't feel man enough to be a boy. And so it's not quite what I would say is classic traditional gender or sex dysphoria, which is I want to be that opposite. It's more like I'm not good enough. I can't be a girl. I'm not good enough to be a girl, which is a very different, I think, feeling. Those girls, it's huge amount of online contagion is going on there. They have found there's nothing more alluring in life than to be told you can be somebody different. And that person who's going to be different is probably going to be very good looking and very popular and edgy and have a huge community and be part of the zeitgeist. And there's almost nothing more alluring than that. And that you'll have a different name and nobody will be able to refer to the old name, the old person, that old, humiliated, awkward, autistic maybe, or certainly distressed self. Nobody will be able to refer to that. You're going to be a new person, very like that YouTube social media influencer that you like, who's also trans. You'll be like them. And the kids who are vulnerable and gullible and cerebral and very disconnected with their body and filled with self-loathing, in their droves they go to this idea that they can be a new person. We never, ever offered that before in life. We never told people you can be somebody different. And they've gone for it. They've said, wow, yes, I'll be somebody different. I remember E. Cummings in a poem way back in the day, like I'm talking 100 years ago, he said something along the lines of, there's a universe next door, are you coming? And I remember thinking, I think I'd go. Like if somebody said, do you want to go? And I'm like, yeah. And that's what this is. It's like, you can be a different person. Do you want to be? And they jump at it. But I do want to say before I go for any further on this point, before anorexia came in, maybe in the 1970s, there was very, very, very few examples of anorexia. It was, freakishly unusual. It was in the medical literature, but it was very unusual. And when it came in and it stayed as a manifestation. Specifically, the canaries in the coal mine were the teenage girls, and it spread in a very socially contagious way. It spread among teenage girls as a way to manifest distress. And after anorexia came in, bulimia came in. And again, spread among teenage girls. It's not confined to teenage girls. Other people can get it, but it's most common among teenage girls, and it spreads like a forest fire among teenage girls. When it comes in, the social contagion. And after bulimia came cutting, and another way to manifest distress. Again, it started among teenage girls and it spread to loads of different cohorts, and it stayed as a way of managing distress. And now what has come in? Gender dysphoria. It's come in. It was never seen before among adolescent girls. It's a way of manifesting distress. And yet again, there's a huge social contagion. To me, it's a golden thread if you want to see what is going on with the teenage girls. We've shown, teenage girls have shown the world for over 50 years now, specifically in that rise of the teenage girl and the glorification of youth and the young teenage girl's body. Within that, teenage girls have shouted, no, you're making me hate myself. You're making me self-conscious. You're making me sexualized before I'm ready. And I hate my body as a result. They've consistently shown us for decades how hard it is to live in this. And we're still not listening.
Yeah. So if you've got, so you have more girls, more teenage girls, presumably then, that you will see as a therapist. What is it like for a parent? How much How much pressure are parents under to go along with this, to affirm this with their child? Who is it that's putting pressure on parents? And how do they respond when they find a therapist who isn't saying to them, you have to affirm this, we can explore what's going on, that's okay for us to do that? How do they respond then when...
It's been very, very, very hard for parents, and that's primarily why I found that's why I founded Genspect. What happened was, it was in a kind of it was COVID, like March 2020, and I had loads of time. As you can see, I'm a big talker and I give a lot of talks. And suddenly COVID happened and it closed down. And so I was asked to give online support group meetings for parents, and I said, "Oh yeah, sure, I'm free now. I might as well." And one meeting a week immediately turned into 2 meetings, 3 meetings, 4 meetings, 5 meetings, and they spread very quickly. And these parents were all saying the same thing. They were saying that there was a complete diagnostic overshadowing, i.e. these kids had ASD, ADHD, eating disorders, anxiety. They had a lot of other diagnoses, but gender dysphoria was trumping all the other diagnoses and suppressing any sort of exploration of what might be going on once gender was said. And that's all the kids, all the parents were describing the same kid. This is a cerebral, awkward, quirky, clever. We know those type. We saw those type in school. They were a bit geeky. They were a bit swatty. They didn't quite fit in. They were a bit socially awkward and very gullible and very vulnerable. That is the kid that generally gets very very into the gender thing. And they spent an awful lot of time online. And so these parents were devastated. We know the type. You know the type. We all know the type. They're a very specific type. And it was nothing to do with gender. This was to do with clever kids who were gullible, who believed this idea that they could be somebody else and that somebody else would be very cool. And because it was so shocking, and when I realized there was a huge secret network of parent groups all around the world who were frantically looking for therapists who might offer exploratory therapy rather than a nodding dog facilitation into heavy and aggressive early medicalization of their children. And I thought, oh my God, what the hell is this world? There's thousands of them. And as a result of that, a year later, I formed Genspect as a kind of a coalition of parent groups. And that we represent something like 18 parent groups over 20 years. 20 countries. Somebody came in there and I just got distracted there. So 18 different organizations. 18 different countries, 20 different organizations.
Right.
And all saying the same thing, saying my kid needs better quality care than what is being offered by the therapists. The therapists are not giving them good quality care. The therapists are just fast tracking them into a medical program. I'm looking for genuine, conventional psychological care for my kids, and that's why I founded it.
Brilliant. Just before, because we're nearly due to go to questions, that's why Sean's bobbed in for us. But just before we do you want to, because I saw that you're running this project called the Bigger Picture Project, where you're gathering stories of detransitioners, and you mentioned about your amazing podcast there as well. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about the Bigger Picture Project, who you're doing it for, why you're doing it, and how people can sort of find out more about that if they want to get involved?
What we're doing in Genspect is, and we'd love if people email Genspect and joined our membership list, because then we can show we don't haunt you. It would be once a month or so that we'd send information out about what's going on, because there's so many things going on, it's easy to miss it. But what we're running it's called Beyond Transition, and it's a project to help people who have been hit and hurt by gender ideology. Most of them are detransitioners, not all of them. Some of them are lost in transition. Some of them feel that they've been very badly hurt and they shouldn't have transitioned, but now they're stuck with it and they don't know what to do. There's a lot of different ways to be hurt by gender ideology. And so we offer a kind of therapeutic support group. We offer to pay for some counseling for people who've been hurt by this. And we offer we're trying to start a database so we can get some numbers, because the Detrans Reddit is phenomenal, but it's a support group for detransitioners, ran by detransitioners. And we're trying to offer, because they've been out in the kind of the Wild West for so long, they're a self-monitoring group, and so they should be, and we support it in every way. There's some brilliant organizations like Detrans Voices and detrans.org and support Detrans. There's a lot out there, but what we're trying to do in Genspect with Beyond Transition which is the bigger project, rather than the bigger picture is just one of the projects that we're doing in Beyond Transition. Beyond Transition is the big project, is just to give help to anybody who's been hurt by gender ideology. And so if you'd like to support us, please do. We have a GoFundMe and things like that. Anything to support this concept, you know.
Brilliant. We'll put the links to all of your work, and there's a lot of stuff that you've pioneered really, and that you're involved in. So we'll put all of those links in the information below the video. I've seen our chat has been buzzing. It looks like there's debate going on there, Sean, and we've got quite a few people involved. Do you want to take it from here?
Absolutely. Before I start on the chat, it's been very interesting, and I didn't realise the time. Actually, I was carried away listening to what you were saying. It was so interesting. I've learnt something every week during this series, and it is absolutely fascinating to actually get to hear the other side of things, and because people just won't talk about it. You can't have these kind of discussions in the public. So I'm really thankful to Mandy and the work that she's put in on this subject, and also to you, Stella, to come on and talk to us about it, because people need to know about these things. There's no point in not talking about it. We need to be educated fully into how these things work. What was interesting is we've had somebody on who is the parent of a girl. She's transitioned from a boy, and I just want to put his perspective to you. He says, when she was 18, my daughter started at so when she was 18, my daughter started at FE college. She changed sex to being a girl, and since then she has never been happier or more assertive. The hormone treatment has been tough on her body. She suffered a lot of acne, but she is much happier. She's now at university studying psychology. So, Stella O'Malley, you need to understand that all teenagers get confused about sex. In the past, we had what was expected and settled on being gay, but some people seem to be born with a desire to be female. I would say they also have the desire to be male as well. If we adults are sensitive to that, we let them take the gender blockers, particularly if their parent supports them in this, because it is their body, not ours.
Could I come in on that? I hope it continues to go well for this kid who's in university, and I think, I really hope it all works out. I think life is long. I think not being able to have children, which is inevitable for somebody who has medically transitioned, won't really hit until at least late 20s, early 30s. I think who knows what that person will think at that point. I think the medical burden on the body, while it's a bit hard in the first couple of years, like the father who sounds so loving and good for him for defending his rights, and I hope it works out well. But acne is one thing. I had acne as a kid. It's whatever. But infertility is a whole other issue that has caused my generation of women an absolutely disorientating and devastating impact. And we won't know what these kids who've transitioned, we won't know what they think about their infertility for many years. It'll be 10 years at least before. Weirdly enough, I was told I was infertile when I was 25. I had endometriosis. And I didn't care. I was like, oh yeah, right, really? I couldn't care. Yeah, right. Just, it wasn't on my radar. I didn't really care. By the time I was 32, I was this breastfeeding earth mother who would walk across hot red coals for her children. So I changed massively, and I've worked with so many people around infertility that I don't underestimate it. And what seems like a good idea today isn't necessarily the best idea in the long term. I don't know. Maybe some of these kids, it's going to be fine. Maybe it will be perfectly fine. And I love the fact that this father could challenge me and we could argue it out. And all I've ever asked for in this is not that I have the answers, not that I think I'm right and he's wrong. I don't know. All I've ever sought since I started to get into this in 2017 is, could we have a debate and discussion about this? Because it feels very high-handed to me. And it feels like we need to really think about a lot of these decisions because we don't know what the future is. And so that's all I have. Who knows? and let's discuss it further.
Which is what we're doing tonight.
Yeah.
I want to thank Peter for
and
coming
I'd like
in
you to give me harder questions. The more we can talk about it in a civilized manner, the more likely we'll have better outcomes for everybody.
Exactly. Yeah, he did actually come back and he said, I think being able to have kids is no great deal. Loads of people don't want to have kids, Stella. There are far too many people in the world, aren't there? Bit controversial there, Peter.
I don't know. It's a biological thing that seems to come over people. I'm not sure about that. Lots of people don't want to have kids. Lots of people at 18 don't want to have kids. Not so many people in their 30s don't want to have kids.
Okay. We'll move on. So thanks for that, Peter. That was a really interesting debate. Let's go to some more questions. Kay Green said right at the beginning you were talking about children in care. So Kay Green says, why children in care? Is it about trauma? So you were talking about the reasons why they may want to change.
You know, when you look at the cohorts, it's very specific, and there's two big groups that would come out. Let's say, for example, within this 4,000% rise in girls who are seeking medical transition, and one is these are very often privileged, middle class, white girls. That's one cohort, very strong. So when you look at anorexia, you think very similar, high achieving, clever, privileged kids. That's one group. And then there's a whole group who are in care, which is a very different group of kids. Do you follow me? And not necessarily white. So it's two very extremely different groups. And sometimes I think, I wonder, are they very much privileged white adults who are looking after these kids in care? Is that making a difference, if you follow me? That's one read I have of it. Another read of it is, as Kay Green said, is it trauma? Is this just trauma? I know Oliver James, the psychologist, said the most unhappy group that he could find in England and Ireland, in UK and Ireland today, was privileged, high-achieving 15-year-old girls. He specifically said they're a very unhappy group. So it could be trauma. It could also be an identity crisis in the classic form of it, as in, who am I? Who am I? I don't know who I am. Who is my family? Who is my background? Where am I? Who am I going? They have noticed that there's a very protective factor to not feeling gender dysphoric or not feeling that you want to seek medical transition, is those from ethnic backgrounds who have a very strong family presence. So that identity is very strong in their family. That makes them a lot less likely to seek medical transition, to have an identity crisis, because they know their identity. They're strong in their identity. So that was an interesting piece of research that I thought, that might explain maybe those who are in care, they've lost who they are. They don't know who they are. Maybe. Who knows? We need more research.
Okay, Fiona English says sloganeering is the modus operandi of politics. Think Boris Johnson and Brexit, get Brexit done, or Trump, make America great again. The gender slogans are of the same ilk, she says. Absolutely right, Stella. Politics interfering in medical care. Mr. Thinly Sliced, love the name. I'd love to know of any other elective medical treatments where a minor is the one in control.
There are none. There are none. Can I just say a little bit about the sloganeering? Sloganeering has got into psychology. So, if it feels good, do it. And if it doesn't feel good, don't do it. And just smile and, the body beautiful and things like this. And it's not great mental health. It's very basic, and it might feel kind of good. My 14-year-old generally parrots it all, and I'm like, it's very basic, and we contain multitudes as humans. We're complex. It doesn't really, that kind of basic kind of sloganeering about the human condition doesn't really, to me, conceptualize what it is to be human. But sorry, keep going.
No, that's fine. Lots more questions to get through. Kay Lawrence says, is the prospect of heterosex now terrifying for girls because of porn access among the young? Are the expectations of young men influenced by porn? Is sexual abuse being normalized?
Yeah, there does seem to be an impact of the heavy use of porn, the huge rise in porn. I know anybody who's, my age will say there was always porn and there was always a huge amount of it. I don't think the numbers bear that out. The access to high-speed Wi-Fi and the prevalence of porn among young people, it certainly never was in my offices as a psychotherapist the way it is now. We're talking about 11-year-olds being exposed to, bestiality and necrophilia and things that just these 11-year-olds would have been looking at boobs 20 years ago. It's just not comparable what they're being exposed to. And as a result, there's a hypersexualization among a generation of children who have been more infantilized on every other level. So they're not allowed out, they're not allowed to walk to school, they've barely walked down to the local shop, and yet they've been exposed to really complex, really shocking levels of sex and pornography. And I don't think it's going very well for them. And I've heard so many shocking stories of girls and boys being exposed to such horrible, horrible hardcore porn that has been really kind of quite shaping on their attitude towards sex. And I know, there was a brilliant film came out of India. I can't think what it's called, something like Gender Dysphoria. And she talked about how people were fleeing from sex, that young girls and young boys, they've either become hypersexualized or they've shut down. For myself, I often think when I meet some, not all, but some people who are very wrapped up in gender identity, they have repressed their sexuality. And so it's a kind of a form of sexual repression. They'll talk about sex, they'll speak about it, they will talk about their gender identity forever, but their actual ability to have sex and to connect and in an intimate level is quite reduced. It feels like a form of sexual repression for some, not for everybody, but for some.
That's really interesting. I'm just thinking again, we're coming up to the top of the hour, so I don't think we've got any more time for any more questions, but I was just reflecting again on the first question that came from Pete Gregson. There may be some people who will transition or medically transition who will be happy with that choice and who will remain happy with that choice. But for me, just having listened to what you've said and having read the CAS review as well about the Tavistock Clinic, there's a whole area of ethics, this whole thing about clinical overshadowing and the fact that there will be, in all likelihood, a whole load of kids who that isn't going to be the case for, who may go through, sort of like the process of medically transitioning and who may well regret that they've lost their fertility or that they've got this lifelong heavy burden on their body in terms of the chemicals that they have to take and other procedures that they might have had done. So there's an ethical balance to be had. And from what you've said to me, it feels like it sounds like you're not opposing people from making that choice as adults. As mature adults, if they're fully informed. But one of the things that we do need to look really carefully at is the puberty blockers and the impacts that can have on people's ability to make mature decisions, having gone through that sort of process and discover what their sexuality is even and who they are.
Yeah, could I just come in? My own approach and the approach of Genspect is not to, let's say, have a gatekeeping situation where you have to be a year in the opposite sex and all that sort of stuff. We're not interested in that. What we think is a public information campaign where people understand what is the impact of infertility, where people understand the heavy medical burden on the body, how you're continuously going back and going back and going back to the doctor to get corrective surgery, to get more corrective surgery, to reduce your hormones, to up your hormones. It's a medicalized life that really starts to grate. After about 5 years, it gets very, very tedious and difficult. After 10 years, there's a heavy drop in kind of satisfaction levels because it's so heavy on the body. And so that's what we want people to know, just so that people know it. We think they'll make better decisions. But I just think until they're adults, our job is to make sure that we protect them from making irreversible decisions. And then when they're adults, make sure that they're informed to make their own decisions and to be perfectly free to do their own thing. I do think our job as adults is to protect kids, though.
Yeah, Yeah, and there's never any situation where we shouldn't be discussing the welfare of kids and making sure that we're doing the right thing, the ethical thing. I am going to just say thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real education, really informative, really interesting. And thank you so much to everybody in the chat for getting involved, for coming along, for listening. Please like and share the video, particularly if you've got mates who are on the political left, because the political left really does need to hear both sides of the, both sides of the coin on this issue, really. And that's what we're trying to do here at Resist, is make sure that people are informed, that debate isn't stifled, and that we can hear the clinical perspectives as well, and then sort of draw some conclusions once we've heard all of that. So thank you so much for coming on today. It's been such a pleasure, and yeah, thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you again next week for another episode. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.